Our second speaker this morning is Jess Collins, who recently completed a thesis in archaeology at the University of Exeter, which was investigating the role of museums as climate change communicators. And she was examining the potential for museums to use archaeology to engage audiences with the climate emergency, using her background in teaching and museum education. She's worked in education roles at the Fitzwilliam Museum, Farmland Museum and Cambridge Folk Museum. And today she's here to establish a place for museum archaeology in the climate change debate. So I'm going to now hand over to Jess for her talk. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. In this presentation, I'd like to address how museums could use their collections of archaeology to engage their audiences with the climate emergency. Using data gathered from my PhD thesis, I'll offer reflections on the creative opportunities that exist and suggest ways for museums to incorporate archaeological artifacts and ideas into climate change engagement. In the growing discourse around museums as climate change communicators, museum archaeology has so far received little attention. Natural sciences collections, with their potential for communicating issues such as biodiversity loss, have perhaps a more direct link to the climate emergency. But archaeology can play an important part. An archaeological perspective crosses the divide between nature and culture and brings a human element to difficult science. It draws on themes of curiosity, imagination and memory, appealing to people's fascination with old objects and past lives. It can provide a range of stories to explore the resilience of past communities in dealing with environmental change, and to contrast with the challenges we face today. During this presentation, I will bring together data gathered during my research to outline a prototype for an archaeology-focused climate change exhibition. Just a quick word about my research, which brought together three connected areas: archaeology as it is presented to the public, museums as sites for learning and inspiration, and how the climate emergency is being communicated. In an attempt to define a role for museum archaeology, I combined empirical observations made at a number of museums with a series of interviews with archaeologists and other curatorial staff here in the Southwest and further afield. The interviews were arranged around a structured questionnaire designed to elicit as much information as possible on how the participants viewed the role of museums as climate change communicators and how archaeology could play a part. So the interview questions included, for example, can you imagine an exhibition about climate change in your museum? How would it look? What do you see as the major challenges and constraints in presenting climate change as a topic? How could an exhibition about climate change link stories of climate and environmental change in the past with people's concerns about climate change today? What opportunities can you envisage for using archaeological objects from your collections in an exhibition about climate change? Climate change can be seen as a political issue. In your opinion, do museums have a responsibility to be contentious? Should all museums be addressing climate change? So this is just a small sample of some of the opinions offered, and it gives a flavour of the wide-ranging nature of our discussions. Starting at the top left of the slide and going around clockwise, you can understand what happened in the past, so you can potentially find ways through to a future. It's very difficult because the archaeology collections per se don't particularly represent climate change. How do you look at a flint shard and go, it's a climate change story? The only way is to make it place-centric, I think. People would be much more interested in seeing an exhibition about climate change over a long period of time, rather than just focusing on the last 50 years. I think museums fundamentally miss a point if they're not dealing with climate change. People can get easily demoralised. Maybe it's best to look at how people can empower themselves. I think museums should at least try to reinterpret their collections in the light of modern society. So engaging a distinct role for archaeology and to assess the unique nature of its contribution, it was important to look at what museums are already doing around climate change. A mosaic of different initiatives exists. These two examples illustrate the diversity of different approaches. In the Atmosphere Gallery at London Science Museum, top left of the slide, various aspects of climate science are covered, including methods for understanding climate past, such as tree rings or ice cores. Quite a challenge to communicate accurate science and climate predictions while making sure the message isn't one of total gloom. To the right of the ice core, this is the Natural History Gallery at Manchester Museum, to an exhibition on climate change a few years ago, when Manchester held the designation of European City of Science. The exhibition showed how traditional galleries can be reimagined in the context of contemporary concerns and familiar objects used in innovative ways. Visitors were helped not just to see the objects, but to understand what they represented through conversations with museum staff and researchers in their field. For example, exploring how the climate changed many times in Earth's remote past. 350 million-year-old plant fossils and coal were linked to people's experience of climate change today. Moving from museum building to mobile museum space, the London-based Museum of Water, pictured top right, engages people in an entirely different way. It is a living, growing collection, with people being invited to donate water from different sources that is in some way important to them through memory or association, along with the accompanying stories. Travelling across the world, the museum creates programmes to explore the interconnected questions of water, migration, urbanisation and climate change, using a combination of science, ecology, anthropology, literature, music and play. Moving back to a more traditional space, the Climate Museum in New York, pictured bottom right, was established to serve as a hub for community engagement and leadership. Art installations, photography exhibitions and digital interactives have been used in several exhibitions which combine art and science to portray climate change and stimulate potential action. The photo is of a video installation from the exhibition In Human Time by artist Peggy Vile, which took the viewer 2 miles down through the Greenland ice sheet, going back 110,000 years in time, showing how ice core science helps us to understand Earth's past and future climate, and to reflect on the fragility of polar ice. Some of the challenges in designing engagement were explored in a 3-day climate hack by the University of Cambridge Museums, seen at the bottom left of the slide. Climate scientists, collections experts, storytellers and makers got together to produce prototype exhibits inspired by the museum's collections. At Cambridge's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the team aimed to form a link between the global story and a local history. Inspired by artworks made by Pacific Islanders from ghost nets, discarded fishing nets causing damage to marine wildlife, the team built a life-size ghost boat in the gallery. Visitors listened to stories on the theme of flooding, both from the Pacific Islands, where people are living with the consequences of sea level rise, and from the nearby Cambridgeshire Fens. The emphasis was on the challenges that communities across the world are facing due to climate change impacts. Finally, the two small pictures in the centre refer to two major exhibitions at the British Museum in recent years: Ice Age Art, Arrival of the Modern Mind, and Indigenous Australia, referred to earlier by Julia. These exhibitions, in offering glimpses of deep time, touched on both archaeology and environmental change, and showed how climate change can work its way into exhibitions on other topics. In Ice Age art, objects like this 13 to 14,000-year-old antler spear thrower, carved as a mammoth, were presented alongside modern artworks, offering the chance to reflect on creativity and its expression, and how little these aspects of human experience have altered. The extreme changes that have taken place naturally during the human story were also represented. So the picture above that we saw earlier in Julie's presentation shows a contemporary artwork from the Australia exhibition where comparatively recent artefacts were used to explain cultural traditions that go back many, many thousands of years. References to the resilience of Indigenous peoples and their understanding of ecology and living in balance with the environment seemed especially relevant. And this was reinforced throughout the exhibition with statements such as, "There is no nature without culture. People, land, and spirit ancestors are one." The exhibition showed how fascinating and beautiful objects can remind us of the diversity of human experience and of the need to continually work out how to live our lives sustainably, based on an intimate knowledge of and respect for the natural world. In my conversations with museum archaeologists, we identified some of the opportunities and challenges involved in using archaeology to explore climate change. Firstly, on the left, the opportunities. Climate and weather were important to people in the past, and archaeological or historic artifacts can illustrate this. Using archaeology can encourage people to make connections between past, present, and future, between climate change long ago and the changes we face now. Effective engagement, exploring the resilience and adaptability of past communities, can help people deal with the implications of climate change today. Some of the challenges identified were, how can artifacts with climate stories be identified? Not every museum has archaeology with an obvious or meaningful climate change connection. However, museums often possess collections and expertise across a range of disciplines. With imagination, objects can be combined and used in informative and creative ways to tell climate change stories. How can stories be told that are affirming and empowering in the face of negative and fearful narratives in the media? Visitors may be tired of politics and doomsday scenarios, and they don't want to be depressed, but they trust museums, have high expectations of them, and want them to move with the times. Many museums are already committed to sustainability and are well placed to take a stand on climate change. Engaging with contemporary climate issues through looking at the past is not without risk. Messages can be confusing. It is important that a distinction is made between natural climate change in the past and how people responded then, and the rapidly progressing human-induced climate crisis we are facing today. Specifically, how can mixed messages about natural climate change in the past and anthropogenic climate change today be avoided? How can the exceptional nature of the current climate emergency be communicated? Archaeology illustrates change. A sense of the inevitability of change could, inadvertently, mask the reality that the climate crisis is not simply about accepting and adapting to change, but about acting to reduce the carbon emissions that have caused the changes in the first place. These word clouds illustrate the frequency of key archaeological words taken from responses of the interview participants. Words relating both to time, such as Mesolithic, medieval, Victorian, and to archaeological ideas or objects, mammoth, sea level, hoard, adapt, a landscape, were included. The word cloud on the left was generated from those words which appeared at least 3 times in the text of the interviews, 35 words altogether, and the one on the right is from words with a frequency of at least 7, 20 words. Of course, depending on their interests, different individuals gave emphasis to different aspects. But the overall picture suggests a strong association between climate change and early prehistory, specifically the adaptation of past people to a changing climate during and following the last ice age. As you can see, artifact and evidence-based words that predominate are wood, bone, animal, and pollen, with sea level and adapt also apparent. So museums are seen as storytellers who communicate with their audiences using evidence-based narratives. This suggests that telling stories is thought to be an important aspect in effective climate change communication. It's important to add that archaeological objects need not be narrowly defined. They could broadly and usefully include items of contemporary archaeology, artifacts from the recent past, or social history collections, maritime archaeology, ethnographic objects, artworks, and photographs. Just as museums can open up the diversity of archaeology to their visitors, so archaeology itself can open up climate change to possibility and opportunity. Inspired by my discussions with museum archaeologists, I'd like to present a prototype for an exhibition that uses archaeology in climate change engagement. Harking back to the curiosity cabinets of early museums, Curious About Climate can be seen as a template for a traditional gallery exhibition arranged around themes, or else as a mobile, low-tech pop-up exhibition. Archaeology in museums has long been about getting audiences to connect with the past through objects. Curious About Climate would similarly encourage people to explore objects, but with the aim of connecting the past with the present. To provide a positive and thought-provoking experience of visitors, the exhibition would appeal to people's innate curiosity, use real artifacts or objects, use interpretative methods involving sound and touch if possible, give space for creativity and reflection, and tell stories that link past, present, and future. There are three aspects or underlying themes that could be explored in the exhibition. Imagination. How do we know what life was like in the past? How do we imagine how life will be in years to come because of climate change? What values, memories, objects, and experiences would you want to save for the future? Resilience. What does archaeology tell us about the ways in which people use their ingenuity and resourcefulness to adjust to climate change in the past? What is needed in the way of cooperation, community, and sustainability to allow us to adapt for the future? And timescales. What does archaeology tell us about the longevity of human experience? In what ways does it highlight the rapidity and urgency of the modern climate emergency? The idea would be to embed these themes within various stories based on displays of objects. The objects could be archaeological artifacts entirely, or a combination of archaeology and objects from other collections, or artifacts illustrating the effects of climate change today on living communities. Even if quite mundane, each object could connect in some way with ideas of memory, of place, of challenge, journeys or adventure, or with narratives of loss and change, identity and belonging, and of individual and community spirit and endeavour. So the next three slides illustrate some possible archaeological stories. Watery worlds. This story would explore people's relationship with water over the millennia, from the melting of the ice at the end of the Ice Age to the effects of rising sea levels today. It could introduce the resourcefulness of people living by water and the implications of this in terms of food production, shelter, safety, and transport. It could look at drainage and land reclamation and the effects of storm and flood from prehistory to the present day. It could examine the effects of drought in the modern world and what this means in terms of climate justice. Examples of objects that could be used are Paleolithic hand axes, along with objects relating to melting ice today, or objects relating to polar exploration. Roman artifacts, alluding to the drainage of the fens or the attempts to drain the Somerset levels, the wealth and status such projects created for some people, pottery, glass, other domestic items. Mesolithic flints, such as those from flooded Doggerland, along with items illustrating the efforts of communities facing floods today. Objects relating to fishing and boats, or objects connected to reclaiming land from the sea for farming or other activities. Make or break, this second story would essentially be about technology. It would show how people from earliest prehistory onwards have used their ingenuity to make tools and machines and alter their surroundings. It could show how technology both solves and creates problems, and how overuse of resources has led to the crisis we have today. It could also showcase technologies for more sustainable living. Just a few examples of objects that could be used: Bronze Age axes, illustrative of the beginnings of metalworking, any objects which show the skills involved, but also associated impacts on resources in the land. Objects which show the minimal carbon footprint of past peoples, for example, organic artifacts such as woven baskets, in contrast to plastic items today. Objects relating to the Industrial Revolution and mass production, for example, coal, model steam engine, Victorian objects of cast iron. Or maybe artifacts of differing materials, illustrating how extraction and production can lead to destruction of biodiversity and landscapes. Maybe weapons signifying conflict over resources. Or objects that illustrate the migration of past peoples and climate refugees today. Reflect and believe. So this third story would explore people's values and beliefs through time in relation to the changing worlds around them. It would be a story about stories. It would challenge visitors to reflect on what archaeology tells us about survival of cultures, of communities, and of the objects people made, possessed, and cared about. It would encourage people to think how objects are invested with meaning and what happens when objects and people are displaced and lost, for example, through conflict, fire, and flood. A few examples of objects: so-called votive objects, such as those from prehistory, found deposited in watery places, like the Bronze Age wooden figure from King Stainton, shown here on view in Exeter Museum, or objects which seem to have had a symbolic association, which have a religious significance. Non-functional objects, such as something beautifully decorated, carved or crafted, an artwork, a musical instrument. Or maybe objects associated with ceremony, celebration, remembrance, or people coming together for a common cause. Any objects which have been deliberately collected or retrieved, or souvenirs. These suggestions demonstrate the diversity of stories that could link archaeological objects with narratives of environmental change in the past and the consequences of climate change today. At its most low-tech and flexible, Curious About Climate could be conceived as literally a cabinet of stacked cases or shelves, each housing an object, arranged as a triptych of stories or themes. Ideally, the objects would act as props for an on-site interpreter or storyteller who would engage the audience, possibly by asking them which object story they would like to hear. There could be spaces for audiences to add a creative response or thoughts of their own, thus helping to co-create the display. To have objects or materials present that could be handled would make the experience of Curious About Climate more tangible and more memorable. To conclude, in this presentation, I've attempted to define a voice for museum archaeology and climate change engagement, and to suggest practical ways in which this voice could be heard. Archaeology sheds a very particular light on the climate emergency. It connects our sense of the future with a perception of time past and time long past. It offers an alternative to the narrow focus on the present or short-term future that is pervasive in so much of the media and generally in modern life. An archaeological voice in climate change narratives provides a way in. It offers an accessible introduction to the challenging questions raised by the climate emergency. I'd say working with people's curiosity about the past is a way of getting them engaged in the first place with ideas around climate change. A Paleolithic hand axe, for example, is arguably a more exciting way to go into the concept of an ice age than a temperature graph on the wall might be, or even an ice core. An ice core is fascinating and beautiful in its way, but is essentially a modern construct, not a thing made with intent thousands of years ago. Narratives of climate change past, present, and yet to come can be linked through archaeological objects and information. Archaeological stories demonstrate the capacity of human communities to survive and adapt to environmental changes and fluctuations. People have been living for millennia with melting ice, rising seas, altered vegetation, diminishing or increasing resources, extreme weather events, and changes in the pattern of seasons. Archaeology provides the evidence of survival and can also inform us of failure to survive. Archaeology gives us the long view. It shows how communities have adjusted in different ways over truly vast timescales. An early Homo sapiens jawbone found in Kent's Cavern in Devon was dated to over 40,000 years old. Archaeology informs us that 20,000 years later, there were people living there still in the Paleolithic. Kent's Cavern today is on the English Channel coast. At the time of these early occupations, millennia before the Channel formation, it was on the edge of a vast resource-rich plain. Stories like these can be used to remind people that we've been around for a very long time indeed. Crucially, they also highlight the unique rapidity with which anthropogenic climate change is happening today. Archaeology can thus encourage people to think ahead to the future they wish to make. Archaeological objects, investigations and reconstructions help us to understand how to live more sustainably. Seeing examples of how past communities lived and worked in a better balance with the natural world gives us glimpses into other ways of doing things. Importantly, this is not about going back, rather a suggestion that an increased empathy with the past can encourage people to think of ways in which humanity can move forward into a more just and sustainable future. Archaeology is happening now. The final point to make in connection with museum archaeology and stories it can tell is to raise the question of how museums are recording the climate stories of today. These stories, flooding events, sea walls washed away, marches for climate action, are all part of the future archive of human responses to the climate threat. Not only does archaeology bring a human voice to impersonal science, it also provides a wealth of artifacts and knowledge. Importantly, my research highlights the opportunities for informed storytelling, using archaeology to connect people with the climate change agenda. The archaeological voice needs to be heard in climate change engagement to help audiences touch the past, attend to the present, and face the future with compassion and hope. Thank you. Some acknowledgements there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jess. That was it was a fantastic talk, and it was great to look at it from a very different perspective. And we've been getting some really positive comments on social media and in the questions just about that. You've really connected with people when you've been talking about informed storytelling,
yeah.
But also how we connect the historic lifestyles with,
yeah.
you know, what that could mean for our modern lives. So really interesting. I know you're joining us for the Q&A later, so I'm hoping that people will be able to sit on their questions and remember their questions, because we're going to break now. Jess, I was quite interested. Obviously, your focus was on archaeology, and it's fascinating. I just wondered if there were sort of themes, and particularly around what you were talking about, around sort of engaging people with stories and narratives, where you feel that is maybe transferable in terms of collections and different things that people have access to that they can use, that might be sort of of broader interest in terms of the different people that might be on the delegate list today.
Yeah, I think, you know, the ideas that I was trying to put across about having themes and stories are very much transferable to other disciplines or collections within a museum. And I think it depends on the extent to which, you know, museum staff or education and interpretation staff are able to combine collections from different areas, depending on the sort of setup within the museum. There may be logistical issues around that, but I think the themes, I think museums, one of the things they're really good at is the cross-disciplinary connections, and I think the ideas I was, you know, attempting to put across about storytelling are certainly transferable to other, you know, other kinds of collections, not just archaeology. I hope, anyway.
Yeah, no, and I agree, and I think it's also highlights those opportunities for collaboration as well. And I think if we're conveying a particular theme or a challenge, I think it's then maybe thinking about how we can broaden that reach by working with others and other collections.
Yes,
that's really interesting.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, yes.
Thank you. There aren't any other questions that have come up, so I just want to thank both of you for giving us your time today. Really, really fascinating talks. And